Emily sat at her desk, staring blankly at the glowing computer screen in front of her. The office around her buzzed with the familiar chaos of ringing phones, hurried footsteps, and half-hearted laughter shared between coworkers. It was all white noise, blending into the oppressive monotony that had consumed her life. She was only halfway through her workday, but it already felt like a lifetime. Her desk was a battlefield of clutter, a cold cup of coffee, a stack of unfinished reports, and sticky notes reminding her of tasks she couldn't bring herself to care about. She leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples as the beginnings of a headache crept in. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered briefly, and Emily closed her eyes, pretending for just a moment that she was anywhere but here. Her mind wandered to distant places, lush forests, sunlit beaches, and quiet mountain trails. But the thought of escaping felt as far away as the images she conjured. Her reverie was interrupted by the familiar ping of an incoming email. She sighed and opened her inbox, expecting another dry memo or passive-aggressive reminder from her manager. Instead, a subject line caught her eye, standing out like a beacon in the sea of corporate monotony. A journey through time. The adventure of a lifetime awaits. Curiosity flickered through her exhaustion as she clicked on the email. The screen filled with a beautifully designed web page featuring an image of a grand, vintage ship sailing through a serene, golden sea. The text below the image read, "Step aboard the Aurora, a vessel like no other. Leave behind the ordinary and embark on a journey where time bends. Mysteries unfold, and dreams come alive. Seats are limited. Book your passage now." Emily scrolled down, her heart racing. The description continued to promise a once-in-a-lifetime experience, a voyage that offered not just escape but transformation. There were no details about the destination or itinerary, only vague hints of wonder and discovery. Beneath the text was a glowing "Reserve Your Spot" button, pulsing faintly as though beckoning her. She hesitated. It seemed too good to be true, and yet, something about it called to her, igniting a spark she hadn't felt in years. For as long as she could remember, she had longed for adventure, real adventure, the kind that shakes you to your core and leaves you changed. Her practical side screamed at her to close the email, to dismiss it as an elaborate scam. But another part of her, the part that still dreamed, couldn't let it go. Her finger hovered over the button for a moment before she clicked. A week later, Emily found herself standing at a fog-shrouded harbor, clutching a small suitcase and staring at the looming silhouette of the Aurora. It was nothing like the gleaming vessel she had imagined. The ship looked ancient, its hull scarred and rusted, as though it had weathered centuries of storms. The faint glow of amber lights flickered in the mist, casting eerie shadows across the dock. A chill ran down her spine, but she dismissed it as the effects of the cold, damp air. A handful of other passengers milled about the dock, their faces pale and distant, as though they were sleepwalking. No one spoke. Emily watched them uneasily, her earlier excitement giving way to a growing sense of unease. The email's promise of wonder felt far away now, replaced by the stark reality of the crumbling ship before her. As she approached the gangway, a crew member stepped forward to greet her. He wore a crisp uniform, but his movements were stiff and unnatural, his smile too wide. His eyes, however, were what unsettled her most. They were dull and glassy, like those of a mannequin. "Welcome aboard," he said in a voice that sounded rehearsed. "Your cabin is ready." Emily nodded mutely and followed him up the creaking gangway. As she stepped onto the ship, the air seemed to change. It was heavier, colder, and carried a faint metallic tang that clung to her throat. She glanced over her shoulder at the harbor, but the mist had thickened, swallowing the shoreline. The crew member led her through narrow, dimly lit corridors lined with faded wallpaper and tarnished brass fixtures. The ship groaned beneath their feet, the sound echoing like a distant wail. Emily tried to ignore the unease building in her chest, focusing instead on the rhythmic click of the crew members' boots. They stopped in front of a door marked C12. "This will be your cabin," the man said, his smile unchanged. He handed her a small key and a folded piece of paper. "Your rules for the voyage." "Rules?" Emily asked, her voice catching. "Yes, he replied, tilting his head slightly. "For your safety and the safety of others, please follow them carefully." Before she could respond, he turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the shadows. Emily stood there for a moment, staring at the paper in her hand. The edges were frayed, and the text was handwritten in an elegant but uneven script. Rules for the voyage. 1. Do not speak to anyone after sunset. 2. Stay away from cabin 36 at all times. 3. Do not open your door if you hear knocking at night. 4. Do not enter the dining hall alone. 5. Always follow the sound of the bell if you become lost. Her stomach tightened as she read the list. The rules were strange, unsettling, even, but she told herself they were probably just an eccentric quirk of the experience. After all, this wasn't a typical vacation. Still, the words lingered in her mind as she unlocked her cabin and stepped inside. The room was small but clean, furnished with a single bed, a writing desk, and a large oval mirror mounted on the wall. A faint, musty smell hung in the air, and the only sound was the steady creak of the ship. Emily set her suitcase down and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the mirror. Her reflection stared back, but something about it seemed off. The lighting, perhaps, or the angle of the glass. She shook her head, brushing off the feeling. It had been a long day, and her mind was playing tricks on her. As she unpacked her belongings, the ship gave a sudden, violent lurch. Emily stumbled, gripping the edge of the desk for support. A low, groaning sound reverberated through the walls, followed by the faint tolling of a bell. The voyage had begun. The first evening passed uneventfully. Emily dined with the other passengers in a grand but decaying hall, its chandeliers casting dim, flickering light over the long tables. The food was surprisingly good, though the atmosphere remained stiflingly quiet. The other passengers barely spoke, their faces blank and unreadable. After dinner, Emily returned to her cabin, feeling more tired than she expected. As she closed the door, she glanced at the list of rules on the desk. The first rule came to mind: do not speak to anyone after sunset. She frowned, wondering why such a rule existed. Shrugging it off, she climbed into bed, pulling the heavy blanket over herself. The ship rocked gently beneath her, and the sound of the waves against the hull was almost soothing. For the first time in days, she felt herself beginning to relax. But as she drifted toward sleep, a faint tapping sound echoed through the cabin. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, pulling Emily from the edge of sleep. She lay still, her body tense beneath the heavy blanket. As her mind raced, the sound was coming from the door, a soft, rhythmic knock that seemed almost polite, yet carried an underlying insistence. Her eyes darted to the desk where the list of rules lay. Do not open your door if you hear knocking at night. Emily's breath caught as the tapping grew louder, each knock reverberating through the cabin. She told herself it was probably one of the crew members, maybe another passenger, but deep down, she knew better. The ship carried an air of unease, an unspoken warning in every shadow and flicker of light. The knock came again, followed by a voice low, soft, and chillingly familiar. Emily opened the door. "It's me." Her heart froze. The voice was hers. "Open the door," it said again, calm and persuasive. "You're just imagining things. It's only me." She clenched the blanket tighter, willing herself to stay put. The knocking stopped abruptly, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. Emily remained still, every muscle in her body tense, until she was certain the presence outside had gone. The rest of the night passed in fits of restless sleep, haunted by fragmented dreams of dark corridors and shadowy figures that whispered her name. The morning brought little relief. The ship's corridors were dimly lit, the pale light filtering through the portholes doing little to dispel the lingering chill in the air. Emily ventured to the dining hall for breakfast, hoping to find reassurance in the company of others. But the atmosphere was as oppressive as before. The other passengers sat in silence, their faces blank and expressionless as they sipped their tea and nibbled on toast. No one met her gaze, and the few conversations that did take place were murmured and brief. She scanned the room, searching for something, anything, that might provide a sense of normalcy. Her eyes landed on a man sitting at the far end of the table, his back rigid and his hands folded neatly in front of him. Unlike the others, he was watching her, his expression unreadable. Emily hesitated before approaching. "Hello," she said, her voice tentative. The man tilted his head slightly, his dark eyes fixed on her. For a moment, he didn't respond, and she wondered if she'd made a mistake. Then he spoke, his voice low and measured. "You're new," he said. Emily nodded, unsure of what to say. "Yes, it's my first time on a ship like this." The man's lips curved into a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Few come here willingly." Her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper. "This ship is not what it seems. Be careful, Miss Emily. The rules are there for a reason." Before she could ask what he meant, the man stood abruptly and walked away, leaving her with more questions than answers. The day stretched on, the hours marked only by the dull creaking of the ship and the occasional tolling of the bell. Emily spent most of her time exploring the corridors, hoping to distract herself from the unease that had taken root in her chest. But the more she wandered, the more the ship seemed to twist and change around her. Hallways stretched longer than they should have. Doors appeared where none had been before, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed behind her, though no one was there. At one point, she found herself standing in front of a door marked 36. A chill ran down her spine as she remembered the second rule: stay away from cabin 36 at all times. The door was unremarkable, its paint faded and its brass handle tarnished. Yet something about it felt wrong, as though the air around it was heavier, charged with an unseen energy. She reached out hesitantly, her fingers brushing against the handle, when a loud creak from the floorboards behind her made her spin around. The corridor was empty. Emily backed away from the door, her pulse racing, and hurried back to her cabin. That night, she was jolted awake by a familiar sound, the tapping. It was softer this time, almost hesitant, but no less insistent. Emily sat up, her heart pounding, as the knocks continued, each one sending a shiver down her spine. "Emily," the voice called again, soft and cajoling. "It's me. Let me in." She clenched her fists, trying to block out the sound, but the voice grew louder, more urgent. "Don't be afraid. Open the door." Her gaze darted to the mirror on the wall. The dim light from the porthole illuminated her reflection, but as she stared, she noticed something was wrong. The reflection wasn't moving. Emily froze. Her own face stared back at her, unblinking, as a slow, chilling smile spread across its lips. The tapping stopped. By the time morning came, Emily was on edge. The ship felt more alive than ever, its walls groaning and its corridors pulsing with a faint, rhythmic vibration. She avoided the dining hall, unable to face the blank stares of the other passengers, and instead roamed the upper deck in search of fresh air and clarity. The fog that had shrouded the harbor when they departed had followed them, blanketing the ocean in a thick, gray haze. The water below was unnaturally still, its surface like polished glass that reflected the ship in eerie detail. As Emily leaned against the railing, a voice spoke behind her. "You shouldn't be here." She turned to see the man from the dining hall standing a few feet away, his expression grim. "What's happening on this ship?" she demanded, her frustration and fear boiling over. "Why are there rules? Who's knocking on my door at night?" The man sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "This isn't an ordinary ship," he said. "It doesn't sail to ordinary places. You're caught between worlds now, Emily. The rules are there to keep you alive." "Alive?" she echoed, her voice trembling. "What happens if I break them?" He hesitated, his gaze flicking to the fog-shrouded horizon. "If you break the rules, you'll be lost, like the others." The others? The passengers, the crew. They weren't always like this. Emily's breath caught. "What do you mean?" He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "This ship feeds on people, their fears, their memories, their very souls. Follow the rules, and you might survive. Break them, and you'll become part of it." Before she could respond, the man turned and disappeared into the fog. That evening, as Emily returned to her cabin, she found something waiting for her on the desk. It was a small, weathered notebook, its cover marked with the initials RT. Inside were pages filled with cramped handwriting, detailing the experiences of someone who had been aboard the Aurora before her. The entries were disjointed, filled with ramblings about shifting corridors, haunting figures, and the oppressive presence of the ship itself. But one line stood out, written in bold, shaky letters. "Do not trust the man in the dining hall. He is not what he seems." Emily stared at the notebook on her desk, her hands trembling slightly. The cramped, uneven handwriting danced across the pages in the dim light of the cabin. "Do not trust the man in the dining hall." The words echoed in her mind, blending with the whispers that seemed to linger in the air. She flipped through the notebook, searching for answers, but the entries grew more fragmented as they went on. Sentences broke off midway, and the handwriting became erratic, as though the writer had been rushing or terrified. One phrase repeated several times, "The ship knows." Emily closed the notebook, her chest tight. The warning about the man unsettled her. He had been the only one who had spoken to her, the only one who seemed aware of the ship's true nature. Yet, if the notebook was to be believed, he wasn't to be trusted. She tried to calm herself, to make sense of it all, but the unease clung to her. The ship felt alive, its walls seeming to close in, its floor creaking under her feet as though it were breathing. That night, as she lay in bed, the tapping returned. It was faint at first, almost hesitant, but it grew louder, more insistent. Emily stared at the door, frozen in place. She clutched the blanket tightly, her heart pounding. "Emily," the voice called, soft and pleading. "It's me again. Please let me in." She shut her eyes, willing the voice to stop. "You're not safe in there," it continued. "You need to come out." Her gaze flicked to the mirror. This time, it reflected her movements normally, but something about the glass felt wrong. The edges seemed darker, as if the shadows in the room were creeping toward it. The voice outside grew more desperate. "Emily, it's not safe. Please, just open the door." She bit her lip, tears welling in her eyes as the knocking intensified. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Emily didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, Emily resolved to find answers. She needed to understand what was happening on the Aurora and why she was here. She returned to the dining hall, hoping to confront the man from before. The room was nearly empty, save for a few passengers sitting silently at their tables. The man was nowhere to be seen. Frustrated, Emily approached one of the passengers, a woman with dark circles under her eyes and trembling hands. "Excuse me," Emily said softly. The woman flinched, her gaze snapping to Emily. She didn't respond, her lips pressed into a tight line. "Please," Emily continued, "I just need to know what's going on here. Do you know anything about the rules?" The woman's eyes widened slightly, and she glanced around the room as if afraid someone might overhear. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Stay away from the mirrors. They watch you." Before Emily could ask more, the woman stood abruptly and hurried out of the dining hall, leaving her alone, determined to uncover the truth. Emily began exploring the ship again. The corridors were as disorienting as ever, their lengths stretching and contracting as she walked. Doors appeared and disappeared, and faint whispers followed her. Just out of earshot, she found herself standing outside cabin 36 again. The air around the door felt colder, heavier, as though the ship itself were warning her to stay away. But curiosity gnawed at her. The second rule, stay away from cabin 36 at all times, felt less like a warning and more like an invitation. Her hand hovered over the doorknob. "Don't," a voice said behind her. Emily spun around to see the man from the dining hall, standing a few feet away, his expression grave. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her fear giving way to anger. "I could ask you the same thing," he replied. "That door isn't meant to be opened." "Why not?" He hesitated, his gaze flicking to the door. "Because what's inside isn't meant for you. It's part of the ship, part of its hunger." Emily frowned. "What does that mean? Hunger for what?" The man sighed, running a hand through his hair. "The ship feeds on us. Our fears, our thoughts. Our very essence. Cabin 36 is where it keeps its collection. A chill ran down her spine. Collection? He nodded. Everyone who's broken the rules ends up in there. Pieces of them, at least. It's how the ship grows stronger. Emily stepped back from the door, her stomach churning. Why didn't you tell me this before? I tried, he said, but you wouldn't have believed me. She opened her mouth to respond, but a sudden creak from the door made her stop. The doorknob turned slowly, and the door began to open on its own. The man grabbed her arm, pulling her away. We need to go. Now. They ran through the twisting corridors, the walls seeming to close in around them. The ship groaned, its structure trembling as though in anger. Where are we going? Emily gasped. To the engine room, the man replied. It's the only way to stop this. They reached a narrow staircase that spiraled downward into the bowels of the ship. The air grew colder as they descended, and a faint, rhythmic thudding filled the space, like the beating of a massive heart. The engine room was a cavernous space filled with rusted machinery and tangled pipes. At the center stood a large, cracked mirror, its surface pulsing with an eerie light. What is that? Emily whispered. The heart of the ship, the man said. It's how it sees us, how it traps us. Emily approached the mirror cautiously. Her reflection stared back, but it wasn't quite right. The edges of her face seemed to blur and shift, and her eyes glowed faintly. How do we stop it? She asked. The man reached into his coat and pulled out a small, ornate dagger. We destroy the mirror. It's the only way. Before Emily could respond, the mirror's surface rippled, and figures began to emerge. The woman from the dining hall stepped out first, her face twisted in a grotesque smile. Then came the other passengers, their bodies contorted and their eyes glowing. The man stepped in front of Emily, holding the dagger tightly. Stay behind me. The figures advanced, their movements jerky and unnatural. The man lunged forward, slashing at the nearest figure, but more emerged from the mirror, their numbers growing. Emily's gaze darted around the room, searching for anything that could help. Her eyes landed on a lever near the far wall. What does that do? She shouted. It's the ship's emergency release, the man replied. But it's risky. It could sink the entire vessel. We don't have a choice. Emily ran to the lever, dodging the figures that reached for her. She gripped it tightly, pulling with all her strength. The machinery groaned, and the ship lurched violently. The mirror shattered, sending shards of light cascading through the room. The figures let out a collective wail before collapsing into ash. When Emily opened her eyes, she was lying on a lifeboat, the Aurora a distant silhouette on the horizon. The ship was sinking, its structure crumbling into the sea. The man sat beside her, his expression somber. Is it over? She asked. He shook his head. The ship never truly dies, but you've bought yourself time. Emily nodded, her body trembling. As the Aurora disappeared beneath the waves, she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't the last she'd see of it. The lifeboat drifted aimlessly on the calm sea, the rhythmic lapping of the waves the only sound breaking the silence. Emily clutched the sides of the small vessel, her breath uneven as she stared at the empty horizon. The Aurora was gone, its towering silhouette swallowed by the ocean. The ship had sunk, its hold on her seemingly broken, but the chill in the air refused to leave her. The man sat across from her, his expression grim. The dagger he had used in the engine room lay at his feet, its blade stained with black ichor. He hadn't spoken since they escaped, his gaze fixed on the water as though expecting the ship to reappear at any moment. Is it really over? Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't look at her. For now. His response sent a shiver down her spine. Hours passed, and the lifeboat bobbed gently in the endless expanse of water. The fog had lifted, revealing a sky painted in soft hues of orange and pink as the sun began to set. For the first time in what felt like days, Emily allowed herself to relax, her muscles loosening as she leaned back against the wooden seat. What's your name? She asked, breaking the silence. The man hesitated before replying. Thomas. Thomas, she repeated, letting the name roll off her tongue. It felt strange to address him by anything other than the man. And you're Emily, he said, glancing at her for the first time since they'd escaped. She nodded. "How do you know that?" "I heard the ship call your name," he said simply. Her stomach churned at the memory of the knocking on her cabin door. The voice that mimicked hers. What was it? The Aurora? Was it alive? Thomas sighed, his shoulders slumping as though under an invisible weight. Alive isn't the right word. The ship is a vessel, in more ways than one. It feeds on fear, on memories, on souls. It's been that way for as long as it's existed. How did you end up there? His jaw tightened, and for a moment, Emily thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "The same way you did. I was looking for something, a way out of my life. The Aurora promised me escape, and I believed it." Emily frowned. "How long were you there?" Thomas didn't respond, his silence speaking volumes. Night fell, the stars glittering in the sky like shards of broken glass. Emily curled up on her seat, exhaustion finally overtaking her. Sleep came in fits and starts, her dreams filled with fragmented images of the ship, shifting corridors, shadowy figures, and the ever-present mirror in the engine room. She woke with a start as the boat jolted. The horizon was no longer empty. A faint light flickered in the distance, growing brighter as the lifeboat drifted closer. It wasn't the glow of a lighthouse or a passing ship. It was something else entirely. The light seemed to pulse, casting rippling reflections across the water. As they neared, Emily realized it was coming from a small, rocky island that jutted out of the sea like a jagged tooth. At its center stood a crumbling stone structure, bathed in the eerie, otherworldly glow. "What is that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Thomas stared at the island, his expression unreadable. "I don't know, but I think we're meant to find out." The lifeboat scraped against the rocks as they reached the island, the sound grating in the still night. Emily climbed out cautiously, her boots crunching on the uneven ground. The air here was different, thicker, colder, carrying a faint metallic tang that reminded her of the Aurora. The structure at the center of the island was ancient, its stones weathered by time and the elements. Emily approached it slowly, her eyes scanning the faded carvings that adorned its walls. The symbols were unfamiliar, but they filled her with an inexplicable sense of dread. Thomas followed close behind, the dagger once again in his hand. "Stay close," he said. They entered the structure, the glow intensifying as they stepped inside. The interior was a single, cavernous chamber, its walls lined with more of the strange carvings. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, and atop it lay an object that seemed to pulse with light, a small, intricately carved box. Emily approached the pedestal, drawn to the box despite the unease clawing at her chest. "Don't touch it," Thomas warned, his voice sharp. She hesitated, her hand hovering above the box. "What is it?" "I don't know," he admitted, "but it's connected to the ship. I can feel it." Emily pulled her hand back, the glow from the box casting strange shadows on the walls. The carvings seemed to shift and writhe, their shapes growing more distinct. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice trembling. He followed her gaze, his eyes widening as he realized what she was seeing. The carvings weren't symbols, they were figures, twisted, grotesque forms that writhed and stretched as though alive. The ground beneath them trembled, a low, guttural sound reverberating through the chamber. The glow from the box intensified, and the shadows began to coalesce, forming a towering figure in the center of the room. Its form was indistinct, shifting and pulsing like a living shadow. Two glowing orbs where its eyes should have been locked onto Emily, and a deep, resonant voice echoed in her mind. "You cannot escape." Thomas lunged forward, slashing at the figure with his dagger. The blade passed through it harmlessly, the shadow reforming as though nothing had happened. The figure reached for him, its amorphous limbs stretching unnaturally. Emily stumbled backward, her gaze darting to the box. Instinct screamed at her to leave it alone, but something deeper, a gut feeling she couldn't ignore, told her it was the key. She grabbed the box, the carved surface cold against her skin. The moment she touched it, the glow vanished, plunging the chamber into darkness. The figure let out a deafening roar, its form flickering and collapsing in on itself. The ground beneath them shook violently, cracks spidering across the stone floor. "Run," Thomas shouted, Grabbing her arm, they sprinted out of the chamber, the walls crumbling around them. The island itself seemed to convulse, the ground splitting open to reveal molten light beneath. They reached the lifeboat just as the structure collapsed entirely, a plume of light shooting into the sky. The sea churned violently, the waves tossing the lifeboat as they rode away from the island. Emily clutched the box tightly, its surface now dull and lifeless. By the time they reached the mainland, the first rays of dawn were breaking over the horizon. Exhausted and shaken, they collapsed onto the beach, the lifeboat abandoned behind them. Emily stared at the box, her mind racing. What do we do with this? Thomas shook his head. I don't know, but whatever it is, it's not over. She nodded, her grip tightening on the box. The ship, the island, the shadows, they were all connected. Pieces of a larger puzzle she couldn't yet see. But one thing was certain, the Aurora might be gone, but its influence lingered, and Emily wasn't ready to let it win. Emily sat cross-legged on the floor of the small seaside in where she and Thomas had taken refuge. The carved box lay in front of her, its intricate patterns catching the dim light filtering through the cracked curtains. She hadn't opened it since retrieving it from the island, but its presence was impossible to ignore. Thomas stood near the window, his silhouette outlined against the rising sun. He hadn't said much since they returned to shore, his demeanor guarded, as though he were waiting for the other shoe to drop. We need to figure out what this is, Emily said finally, breaking the silence. Her voice was firm, but there was a tremor beneath the words. Thomas turned to her, his face etched with exhaustion. Do you think opening it will help? It might just make things worse. Worse than the ship, the island, and whatever that thing was, she countered. We can't ignore it. Thomas, you felt it too. This box is connected to all of it. If we don't do something, it's only a matter of time before she could finish. A faint humming filled the room. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, resonating through the walls and floor. The box vibrated slightly, the patterns on its surface beginning to glow faintly. Emily and Thomas exchanged a look, their unease mirrored in each other's eyes. Fine, Thomas said. Open it, but be ready for anything. Emily reached out, her fingers brushing against the cool surface of the box. The glow intensified as she lifted the lid, revealing a dark, swirling substance inside. It was neither liquid nor gas, its form shifting and pulsing as though alive. What is that? Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, Emily replied. As they stared at the contents, a voice echoed through the room. It was deep and resonant, carrying a weight that seemed to press against their very souls. You cannot run. The Aurora calls to you. Emily slammed the lid shut, her heart racing. The humming ceased, and the glow faded, leaving the room in silence. The next few days were a blur. Emily and Thomas scoured libraries, archives, and local records, searching for any mention of the Aurora or the box. The ship's existence was barely documented, as though it had been deliberately erased from history. One night, while flipping through an old maritime journal, Emily found a passage that made her blood run cold. There are whispers of a ship that sails between worlds, feeding on the lost and the broken. Those who board never return, save for the few who are marked by its curse. She read the words aloud to Thomas, who frowned. Marked? Emily nodded. I think that's us. We escaped, but it's not letting us go. Thomas leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. So what do we do? Destroy the box? Bury it? Throw it into the ocean? I don't think it's that simple, Emily said. The box isn't just a thing, it's a connection. To the ship, to the island, to whatever force is behind all of this. Destroying it might sever the link, but it could also release whatever's inside. Thomas sighed, his frustration evident. Then what's the plan? Emily hesitated before answering. We find out where the Aurora came from. If we can understand its origin, maybe we can stop it for good. Their search led them to a remote coastal town several hours away. The place had a reputation for its maritime history and its legends of ghost ships that appeared during storms. The locals were wary of strangers, their eyes lingering on Emily and Thomas as they walked through the narrow, cobblestone streets. An elderly woman sitting outside a small bookstore waved them over, her expression unreadable. "You're looking for something," she said, her voice raspy but firm. Emily hesitated before nodding. "We're trying to learn about a ship, the Aurora." The woman's eyes narrowed, and she motioned for them to follow her inside. The store was cramped and dimly lit, its shelves lined with weathered books and nautical artifacts. "The Aurora," she repeated, her tone heavy with meaning. "A cursed vessel, if ever there was one. My grandfather told me stories about it when I was a girl." "What kind of stories?" Thomas asked. The woman sat behind the counter, her gaze distant. "They say the Aurora wasn't built by men, but summoned. It appeared during a storm centuries ago, rising from the depths like a phantom. The sailors who boarded it spoke of shifting corridors and shadows that whispered their names. Most never returned. And those who did?" Emily pressed. "They were changed," the woman said. "Haunted, marked, just like you." Emily's breath caught. "How do you know?" The woman's gaze flicked to the box Emily carried. "Because that box binds you to it. It's not just an artifact, it's a piece of the Aurora itself." "Is there a way to destroy it?" Thomas asked. The woman shook her head. "The Aurora can't be destroyed. Not in the way you think. It's a force, a presence that exists beyond our world. But there might be a way to sever its connection to you." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "There's a lighthouse on the edge of town, abandoned for years. They say it marks the boundary between this world and the next. If you take the box there, you might be able to close the door it's opened." The lighthouse stood on a jagged cliff overlooking the sea, its silhouette stark against the darkening sky. The wind howled as Emily and Thomas approached. The box clutched tightly in Emily's hands. The door creaked as they pushed it open, revealing a narrow spiral staircase that wound its way upward. The air inside was heavy and cold, the walls lined with peeling paint and faded graffiti. As they climbed, the box began to hum again, its glow seeping through the cracks in the lid. Emily's grip tightened, her knuckles white. When they reached the top, they found themselves in a circular room with a massive, cracked lens at its center. The view from the windows was obscured by the thick fog that had rolled in, but the sea below roared with fury. Emily set the box on the floor, the hum growing louder. "What now?" Thomas asked. Emily opened the box, the swirling substance inside pulsating with light. The room trembled, and the shadows in the corners seemed to stretch and writhe. A voice echoed through the air, deep and resonant. "You cannot escape. The Aurora will find you." The substance inside the box began to rise, forming a dark, amorphous shape that towered over them. Its glowing eyes locked onto Emily, its presence suffocating. Thomas lunged at the figure with the dagger, but it swatted him aside effortlessly, sending him crashing into the wall. Emily stood her ground, her heart racing. "You won't take me," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. The figure laughed, a sound that reverberated through her very bones. "You are already ours." Emily reached into the box, her fingers closing around something solid. She pulled it out, a small, jagged shard of the mirror from the Aurora's engine room. The figure recoiled, its form flickering. Emily held the shard aloft, its surface glowing with an otherworldly light. "This ends now," she said, plunging the shard into the box. The room exploded with light, the force knocking Emily and Thomas to the floor. The figure let out a deafening roar before disintegrating, its form collapsing into nothingness. When the light faded, the box was gone. Emily and Thomas stumbled out of the lighthouse, the wind and rain battering them as they made their way back to town. The weight that had pressed against them for so long was gone, replaced by a quiet emptiness. They didn't speak as they returned to the inn, their exhaustion too great for words. But as Emily lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, she felt something she hadn't in a long time: hope. The Aurora was gone, for now, and if it ever returned, she would be ready. The days that followed the destruction of the box were marked by a strange, disorienting calm. Emily and Thomas remained in the small coastal town, each silently processing the events that had brought them there. The lighthouse still stood as a silent sentinel on the edge of the cliff, its cracked lens catching the occasional glint of sunlight. But the quiet was deceptive. Emily could feel it in the air, a faint tension that refused to dissipate. It lingered in the shadows of the inn, in the depths of her dreams, and in the corners of her mind when she was alone. Even though the box was gone, something still wasn't right. On the third night after the incident at the lighthouse, Emily woke with a start. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside her window. At first, she thought it was just another nightmare, but then she heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. Her chest tightened as the sound grew louder, more deliberate. It was coming from the window this time. Emily. Her name was spoken in a low, familiar voice. Emily, open the window. You know me. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. She didn't move, didn't dare turn toward the window. The voice came again, calm and insistent. Let me in. Her heart pounded as she reached for the lamp on her bedside table, fumbling in the darkness. When the light flickered on, the tapping stopped. Emily forced herself to look at the window. It was empty, the glass reflecting only her pale, terrified face. But in the faint reflection, she thought she saw something behind her, a dark shape, shifting and indistinct. She spun around, but the room was empty. The next morning, Emily told Thomas what had happened. It's still here, she said, her voice trembling. I don't know how, but it's still here. Thomas frowned, leaning back in his chair. The two of them were sitting in the small dining area of the inn, the smell of sea salt wafting through the open windows. I don't understand, he said. We destroyed the box. That should have severed the connection. Maybe it wasn't enough, Emily replied. Or maybe the box wasn't the source. It was just a part of it. Thomas rubbed his temples, his frustration evident. So what do we do now? If the Aurora is still out there, we need to find it before it finds us. Emily nodded, though the thought of confronting the ship again made her stomach churn. We need to learn more. There has to be something we missed, something that can stop it for good. Their search led them back to the bookstore, where the elderly woman greeted them with a wary expression. I told you the lighthouse might help, she said, her tone defensive. If it didn't work, there's nothing more I can do. We think the Aurora is still out there, Emily said, and we need to know everything you can tell us about it. The woman hesitated, her gaze flicking between Emily and Thomas. Then she sighed and motioned for them to follow her. She led them to a back room filled with dusty tomes and faded maps. From one of the shelves, she pulled a large, leather-bound book and set it on the table. This is the Chronicle of the Sea, she said. It's a collection of legends and records about the strange and unexplained. The Aurora is mentioned several times. Emily and Thomas pored over the pages, their fingers tracing the faded text. One passage caught Emily's attention. The ship is said to be bound to a keeper, a figure who maintains its power and connection to the world. The keeper is neither fully alive nor dead, existing as a vessel for the ship's will to sever the Aurora's hold. The keeper must be destroyed. Emily's blood ran cold. A keeper? The woman nodded. If the ship is still calling to you, then the keeper must still exist. Thomas leaned forward, his expression grim. How do we find them? The woman hesitated. The keeper is tied to the ship, but they can leave it temporarily. If the Aurora is still out there, the keeper won't be far. The realization that the keeper might be hunting them was a chilling one. Emily and Thomas decided to leave the inn, not wanting to endanger the other guests. They packed their belongings and set out for a remote cabin in the woods that the woman had suggested, a place where they could plan their next move in relative safety. The cabin was small but sturdy, nestled among towering pines. It was far from the coast, far from the lingering sense of dread that seemed to emanate from the sea. For the first time in days, Emily felt a semblance of security, but it didn't last. That night, as the wind howled through the trees, Emily woke to the sound of footsteps outside the cabin. She sat up, her body tense. "Thomas," she whispered, shaking him awake. He stirred, blinking groggily. "What is it?" "Someone's outside," she said. The two of them crept to the window, peering out into the darkness. At first, they saw nothing, but then, faintly illuminated by the moonlight, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall and thin, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its face was obscured by a hood, but its presence was unmistakable. "The keeper," Thomas muttered, his voice barely audible. The figure stopped in front of the cabin, its head tilting as though listening. Then, in a voice that sent chills down Emily's spine, it spoke. "Emily, Thomas, you cannot run." The two of them backed away from the window, their hearts pounding. "What do we do?" Emily whispered. Thomas grabbed the dagger from his bag, his grip firm. "We fight." The next few moments were a blur. The keeper slammed against the door, its strength far greater than anything human. The wood splintered, the sound echoing through the cabin as Emily and Thomas scrambled to defend themselves. When the door finally gave way, the keeper stepped inside. Its face was still hidden, but its presence filled the room, suffocating and oppressive. Thomas lunged at it with the dagger, but the keeper moved with inhuman speed, dodging the attack effortlessly. It raised a hand, and Thomas was thrown across the room, crashing into the wall with a sickening thud. Emily grabbed a heavy lamp from the table and hurled it at the keeper, but it shattered harmlessly against its form. "You cannot fight me," it said, its voice echoing. "You belong to the Aurora." Desperation clawed at Emily as she looked around the room for anything she could use. Her eyes landed on a small mirror hanging on the wall. An idea struck her, a dangerous, reckless idea. She grabbed the mirror and held it up, angling it toward the keeper. The reflection was distorted, its form writhing and shifting in the glass. The keeper recoiled, a guttural growl escaping its lips. "Thomas!" Emily shouted. "The mirror! It's connected to the Aurora." Thomas staggered to his feet, grabbing the dagger again. "Hold it steady," he said. Emily kept the mirror raised as Thomas lunged at the keeper once more. This time, the blade found its mark, sinking into the keeper's chest. The figure let out an unearthly scream, its form flickering and collapsing in on itself. The mirror shattered, and the cabin was plunged into silence. When the dust settled, Emily and Thomas stood amidst the wreckage, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The keeper was gone, its presence erased. But as Emily looked at the shards of the broken mirror, she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. "Did we stop it?" she asked, her voice trembling. Thomas hesitated before answering. "For now." Emily and Thomas sat in the ruins of the cabin, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The keeper was gone, its form dissipating into the night like smoke. But the damage it left behind was undeniable. The door hung crookedly on its hinges. The walls bore deep gashes from its unnatural strength, and shards of the mirror lay scattered across the floor. "Is it over this time?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Thomas leaned against the wall, clutching his side where he'd slammed into the timber. "I don't know. Maybe. But we've thought that before." Emily's gaze drifted to the broken mirror on the floor. Something about the shards unsettled her. They seemed darker than they should have been, as though they still held a fragment of the keeper's presence. She shivered and looked away. "We can't stay here," she said finally. "If there's another keeper, or worse, this place won't hold them off." Thomas nodded, pushing himself to his feet with a grimace. "Agreed. But we need a plan. Running won't solve this. We need to end it." Emily hesitated. "Do you think we can?" He met her gaze, his expression resolute. "We have to try." The first step was figuring out where the Aurora had come from. The Chronicle of the Sea had mentioned that the ship was summoned rather than built, but the details were vague. Emily and Thomas needed more information, something concrete that would lead them to the root of the ship's power. They returned to the coastal town the next morning, seeking out the elderly woman who had first told them about the Aurora. She was waiting for them outside the bookstore, as though she'd known they would come. "You survived," she said, her tone equal parts surprised and relieved. "Barely," Emily replied, "but it's not over. We need your help." The woman gestured for them to follow her inside. The shop was as dim and dusty as before, but this time she led them to a locked cabinet at the back of the store. From within, she retrieved an ancient, leather-bound tome, its pages yellowed with age. "This is the Codex Mare," she explained. "It's older than the Chronicle, and far more dangerous. It doesn't just record stories, it holds pieces of the truth." Emily opened the book cautiously, her fingers brushing against the brittle pages. The text was written in an archaic language she didn't recognize, but the illustrations were clear enough. One page depicted the Aurora rising from the sea, its black sails billowing in a storm. Surrounding the ship were dark tendrils, reaching up from the water as though pulling it from the depths. The Aurora was summoned, the woman said, her voice low, not by chance, but by intent. It was called to this world as a weapon, a vessel for power, and those who called it paid the price. Who called it? Thomas asked. The woman shook her head. That part is unclear, but the Codex suggests the summoners were part of an ancient order, a cult devoted to crossing the boundaries between worlds. Emily's fingers tightened on the book. If they summoned it, then there has to be a way to banish it. Do you think the Codex could tell us how? The woman hesitated. Perhaps, but be warned, this book is dangerous. The knowledge within it is not meant for the faint of heart. Emily nodded. We'll take the risk. The Codex was not an easy read. Its pages were filled with cryptic symbols, fragmented narratives, and riddles that seemed designed to confuse. Emily and Thomas spent days poring over it, their frustration mounting as they struggled to piece together its meaning. But then, on a page near the middle of the book, they found something that made their blood run cold. It was an illustration of the Aurora's mirror, the same one they had destroyed at the lighthouse. The accompanying text described it as the ship's anchor, a physical manifestation of its connection to this world. But we destroyed it, Emily said, frowning. At the lighthouse. Thomas shook his head, his expression grim. We destroyed one piece of it. The Codex says the mirror isn't just an object, it's an idea, a reflection of the Aurora's power. There could be more. They read on, finding references to 3 anchors tied to the Aurora, the mirror, the box, and a third object whose description was incomplete. The third anchor, Thomas murmured. If we destroy it, maybe we can sever the Aurora's connection for good, but we don't know what it is. Emily said, frustration lacing her voice. How do we find something when we don't even know what we're looking for? Thomas pointed to a passage near the bottom of the page. The text was faded, but they could just make out a single word, Gravesend? A location. Emily said. Thomas nodded. It's a start. Gravesend was a small, windswept village perched on the edge of a cliff overlooking the sea. Its streets were narrow and cobblestoned, its buildings weathered by salt and wind. Emily and Thomas arrived just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the village. The locals eyed them warily as they made their way to the inn, their whispers carrying on the wind. They wasted no time, heading straight to the village's tiny library in search of answers. It was there, in a dusty ledger of maritime records, that they found their first lead. The Aurora had been sighted near Gravesend several times over the centuries, always during storms. The records mentioned a cave on the cliffs where strange artifacts had been found, objects that seemed to hum with an unnatural energy. That has to be it, Emily said. The third anchor. The cave was hidden beneath the cliffs, accessible only during low tide. Emily and Thomas descended carefully, the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks filling the air. The entrance was narrow, its walls slick with moss and sea spray. Inside, the air was cold and damp, carrying the faint scent of brine. As they ventured deeper, their flashlights illuminated strange carvings on the walls, symbols similar to those in the Codex. The ground beneath their feet grew uneven, and the sound of dripping water echoed through the chamber. Then they saw it. At the center of the cave was an altar, carved from black stone. Atop it rested a strange, metallic orb, its surface covered in swirling patterns that seemed to move under the light. The third anchor, Thomas whispered. Emily approached cautiously, her heart pounding. The air around the orb was heavy, as though the object itself was exerting a gravitational pull. Before she could touch it, a voice echoed through the cave. You cannot destroy me. The shadows in the cave began to move, coalescing into a familiar shape. The Keeper. The battle that followed was unlike anything Emily and Thomas had faced before. The Keeper was stronger this time, its form shifting and multiplying as it attacked. Thomas lunged at it with the dagger, but the shadows reformed faster than he could strike. Emily grabbed a loose rock from the ground, hurling it at the keeper, but it passed through harmlessly. "We can't fight it," Thomas shouted. "We have to destroy the orb." Emily turned to the altar, her hands trembling as she reached for the orb. The moment her fingers touched it, a searing pain shot through her arm, but she didn't let go. The keeper let out a deafening roar, its form collapsing as the orb cracked under Emily's grip. "Emily!" Thomas shouted, running to her side as the cave began to shake. With a final effort, Emily threw the orb to the ground, shattering it into pieces. The keeper screamed one last time before dissolving into nothingness. The cave began to collapse, the walls crumbling as the sea rushed in. Emily and Thomas barely made it out, the water lapping at their heels as they scrambled onto the rocks. When they returned to Gravesend, the storm that had been brewing on the horizon began to dissipate. The air felt lighter, the oppressive presence of the Aurora finally gone. "Is it over?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas nodded, though his expression was cautious. For now, as they stood on the cliffs, watching the sun rise over the sea, Emily allowed herself to hope. The Aurora's anchors were destroyed, its power severed, but deep down, she knew it wasn't the end. The Aurora was a force beyond comprehension, and forces like that didn't die easily. For now, though, they had one, and that was enough. The sunrise over Gravesend was breathtaking, a fiery spectacle that cast a warm glow over the cliffs and the restless sea below. Emily stood on the edge, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as the salty breeze whipped through her hair. Behind her, Thomas leaned against a weathered post, his exhaustion evident but his resolve unbroken. "We did it," Emily said softly, her voice almost drowned out by the crashing waves. "For now," Thomas replied. The words carried a weight neither of them could ignore. They had destroyed the third anchor, severing the last of the Aurora's physical ties to their world. The keeper had been vanquished, its form dissolving into the void, and the oppressive presence that had haunted them since the ship sank seemed to lift. But both of them knew that the Aurora was not truly gone. It was a force, an idea, and forces like that had a way of returning. In the days that followed, Emily and Thomas found themselves unable to leave Gravesend. The village, with its quaint cobblestone streets and salty air, felt like the eye of a storm. It was quiet, almost too quiet, and yet there was an unshakable sense that something lingered just beyond the horizon. Emily spent her time poring over the Codex Mare, determined to find any clue that might help them understand the Aurora's true nature. She read late into the night, her fingers tracing the faded ink as she tried to make sense of the fragmented passages. Thomas, on the other hand, became restless. He took to wandering the cliffs and the beach, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the ship. The isolation and unease were taking their toll, and both of them knew it. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars began to appear, Thomas returned to the small inn where they were staying. Emily was seated at a corner table, surrounded by open books and scattered notes. "You're going to burn yourself out," he said, his tone half concerned, half chiding. Emily didn't look up. "There's something here. I can feel it." Thomas sat down across from her, rubbing his temples. "What exactly are we looking for?" "We destroyed the anchors. Emily, we stopped the keeper. What more can we do?" She finally met his gaze, her eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. "The Aurora isn't just a ship. It's a doorway. The anchors were only part of it. But there's something else, something that ties it to this world. And you think the Codex will tell us what that is?" "It has to," she said, her voice firm. "Otherwise, it'll just keep coming back." That night, Emily dreamed of the Aurora. The ship rose from the sea, its black sails billowing in a storm that churned the water into a frothy maelstrom. Shadows writhed on its deck, their forms indistinct but undeniably menacing. At the center of it all stood a figure cloaked in darkness, its hollow eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It raised a hand, pointing directly at her. "You cannot escape." Emily woke with a gasp, her body drenched in sweat. She sat up, clutching the blankets tightly as her heart pounded in her chest. The dream had felt so real, so vivid, and the words still echoed in her mind. She looked around the room, half expecting to see the keeper standing in the shadows. But the room was empty, save for the faint flicker of the lamp on the bedside table. Taking a deep breath, she swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood. Sleep was impossible now. In the early hours of the morning, Emily found herself back at the library in Gravesend. The building was cold and dimly lit, the smell of old paper and mildew filling the air. She flipped through the Codex Mare, her eyes scanning the pages with an intensity born of desperation. And then she found it. A single passage, tucked away near the end of the book, written in the same cryptic language as the rest. She couldn't read it, but the accompanying illustration sent a chill down her spine. It depicted a towering figure standing on the deck of a ship, its hands raised as though commanding the storm. Beneath the ship, dark tendrils reached up from the depths, entwining with the figure's form. At the bottom of the page was a single word, written in bold, jagged letters, Nexus. Emily and Thomas pored over the passage, trying to decipher its meaning. With the help of a dusty lexicon they found in the library's archives, they managed to piece together a rough translation. The Aurora, it seemed, was more than just a doorway. It was a nexus point, a place where the boundaries between worlds were thin. The figure in the illustration, referred to only as the Navigator, was the one who controlled it, guiding the ship through the storm. It's not the anchors that give the Aurora its power, Emily realized. It's the Navigator. Thomas frowned. But we've never seen this. Navigator. Could it be the Keeper? Emily shook her head. The Keeper was tied to the anchors. The Navigator is tied to the ship itself. If we can find them, we might be able to sever the Aurora's connection for good. But how do we find them? Emily hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of the page. The Aurora has always come to us. Maybe we let it. Thomas stared at her, his expression a mix of disbelief and concern. You're talking about summoning it. It's already connected to us, she said. It's been calling to us ever since the ship sank. If we can use that connection to draw it out, we might have a chance. The preparations took days. Emily and Thomas gathered supplies, mapped out their plan, and readied themselves for what could very well be a one-way journey. They chose a remote stretch of coastline far from Gravesend, a place where the cliffs rose high above the sea and the wind howled like a living thing. On the appointed night, under a moonless sky, they began the ritual. Emily stood at the edge of the cliff, the Codex Mare open in her hands. Thomas stood behind her, holding the dagger tightly. The air was cold, the wind biting at their skin as Emily recited the words written in the book. At first, nothing happened. The sea below remained calm, the sky clear. But then, slowly, the waves began to churn. A low hum filled the air, growing louder with each passing moment. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint sound of whispers. And then they saw it. The Aurora emerged from the mist, its black sails cutting through the darkness like knives. The ship loomed larger than ever, its presence suffocating as it drew closer to the cliffs. At the bow stood the Navigator. Its form was indistinct, a shifting mass of shadows that seemed to absorb the light around it. Its hollow eyes burned with an unnatural fire, and as it raised a hand, the ship came to a halt. "You cannot escape," it said, its voice echoing across the waves. Emily and Thomas stood their ground, their resolve unwavering. "You're right," Emily replied, "but we're not trying to escape." She stepped forward, the codex clutched tightly in her hands. "You brought us here. Now let's finish this." The confrontation was unlike anything they had faced before. The Navigator wielded the storm itself, the wind and waves crashing against the cliffs as though trying to tear them apart. Thomas fought to hold his ground, his dagger useless against the intangible form of the Navigator. Emily focused on the codex, her voice steady as she recited the final passage. The Navigator let out a deafening roar, its form flickering as the words took effect. The Aurora began to tremble, its black sails disintegrating into ash. Emily's voice grew louder, drowning out the storm. The Navigator faltered, its form collapsing as the ship began to sink. With a final, ear-piercing scream, the Navigator dissolved into the void. and the Aurora vanished beneath the waves. When the storm cleared, the sea was calm once more. Emily and Thomas stood on the edge of the cliff, their breaths ragged but their hearts steady. "It's over," Thomas said, his voice filled with quiet relief. Emily nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "For now." And as they turned to leave, the first rays of dawn broke over the sea, casting the world in golden light. Emily and Thomas returned to Gravesend exhausted but triumphant. The final confrontation with the navigator had left them both shaken, but for the first time in weeks, there was a sense of closure. The Aurora was gone, pulled back into the void, and with it, the haunting echoes of its influence seemed to fade. For a while, it was easy to believe the nightmare was over. The coastal village, quiet and windswept as always, felt like a sanctuary. Emily and Thomas stayed on, finding solace in the simplicity of life there. Emily spent her mornings walking along the beach, collecting shells and breathing in the salty air, while Thomas helped local fishermen repair their nets. But even in the calm, the shadows lingered. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily found herself standing on the cliffs overlooking the sea. The waves were calm, the water catching the fading light and turning it to gold. It should have been peaceful, but she couldn't shake the sense of unease that had been growing over the past few days. She'd been dreaming of the Aurora again. Each night, the ship appeared, shrouded in mist, its black sails cutting through the darkness. She would see it only for a moment before it disappeared, leaving behind a faint, whispering echo. At first, she thought it was her mind playing tricks on her, a residual fear from their ordeal. But the dreams felt too real, too vivid. "Emily," she turned to see Thomas approaching, his expression wary. "I thought you were helping the fishermen," she said. "I was," he replied, "but I saw you out here and, well, I figured you'd be thinking about it." Emily sighed, wrapping her arms around herself. "The dreams haven't stopped." Thomas frowned. "You think it's still out there?" "I don't know," she admitted, "but I can feel it, like it's waiting for something." Thomas was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Maybe we missed something," he said finally. Emily nodded, her stomach tightening. The next day, they returned to the library, combing through the Codex Mare once more. Emily flipped through its pages with a growing sense of frustration. The passages about the Aurora were cryptic at best, and the language was difficult to translate. "It's like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing," she muttered, running a hand through her hair. Thomas was seated across from her, frowning at a different book. "What if it's not about the ship?" he said. Emily looked up. "What do you mean?" "What if it's about us?" he said. "We've been tied to the Aurora since the beginning. The Keeper, the anchors, the navigator, they all focused on us. What if we're part of the reason it keeps coming back?" Emily's breath caught. "You think we're still connected to it?" Thomas nodded. "It makes sense. If the ship is a nexus, a place where worlds meet, then maybe we're its link to this one. If we're not free, neither is it." The idea unsettled Emily, but it also gave her a sense of clarity. If they were still connected to the Aurora, then breaking that connection might be the key to ending its influence for good. But how? As they continued searching, Emily found a passage near the back of the Codex that seemed relevant. It described a ritual of severance, a way to break ties with otherworldly forces. The text was fragmented, but the instructions were clear enough. A place of transition must be chosen, a threshold where two worlds meet. An offering must be made, something tied to the connection. The severance must be witnessed by fire, the symbol of renewal. Emily and Thomas exchanged a look. "The cliffs," Thomas said. Emily nodded. "And the offering?" He gestured to the dagger on the table. "We've used it against the Keeper and the Navigator. It's tied to the Aurora, just like we are." The ritual was set for the next full moon. Emily and Thomas prepared carefully, gathering everything they would need and reviewing the instructions until they were confident they understood each step. As the night approached, the unease that had been simmering in the background grew stronger. Emily's dreams became more vivid, the Aurora looming larger each time. The whispers followed her into her waking hours, faint but insistent. "You cannot escape." On the night of the ritual, The cliffs were bathed in silver light. The moon hung low in the sky, its reflection shimmering on the waves below. Emily and Thomas stood at the edge of the cliff, the dagger resting on a makeshift altar between them. They had drawn a circle of salt around the altar, its edges illuminated by flickering candlelight. Emily took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Are you ready?" Thomas nodded, though his grip on the dagger was tight. "Let's do this." Emily began the chant, her voice steady despite the chill in the air. The words from the codex felt foreign on her tongue, but as she spoke them, the atmosphere around them seemed to shift. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint sound of whispers. The waves below grew restless, crashing against the rocks with increasing force. As Thomas stepped forward to place the dagger on the altar, the air grew heavy, and a low hum reverberated through the cliffs. Then the shadows came. They rose from the ground, dark and shifting, coalescing into familiar shapes. The keeper appeared first, its hollow eyes burning with malice. Behind it came the navigator, its form wreathed in mist. "You cannot sever what is eternal," the navigator said, its voice a deafening roar. Thomas grabbed the dagger, holding it out defensively. "We're ending this. Tonight." The figures advanced, their movements slow but deliberate. Emily continued the chant, her voice rising above the sound of the wind and the waves. The shadows lashed out, striking the edge of the salt circle. The candles flickered but held, the barrier keeping them at bay, for now. "Hurry," Thomas shouted. Emily reached the final line of the chant, her voice trembling as she spoke the words. The dagger glowed faintly, its surface shimmering with an otherworldly light. Thomas raised it high, his gaze locked on the figures before them. "This ends now." With a swift motion, he drove the dagger into the altar. The reaction was immediate. The ground beneath them trembled, and a blinding light erupted from the dagger, engulfing the shadows. The keeper and the navigator let out deafening screams, their forms disintegrating into ash. The wind howled, the waves roaring as the connection between them and the Aurora was severed. Emily and Thomas clung to each other as the light faded, leaving behind an eerie silence. The dagger was gone, the altar reduced to a pile of smoldering rubble. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Thomas let out a shaky breath. Did it work? Emily looked out at the sea, where the horizon was clear and calm. The oppressive presence that had haunted them was gone. "I think so," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. In the days that followed, Emily and Thomas began to feel a sense of normalcy returning. The dreams stopped, and the whispers faded. The village of Gravesend seemed brighter, its people warmer and more welcoming. For the first time in what felt like forever, they allowed themselves to hope. But deep in her heart, Emily knew the Aurora was not gone forever. Forces like it never truly disappeared. They only waited, and if it ever returned, she and Thomas would be ready. Emily and Thomas stayed in Gravesend for several weeks after the ritual, savoring the calm that had finally returned to their lives. The oppressive weight that had clung to them since their first encounter with the Aurora was gone. The air felt lighter, the days brighter, and the nights blessedly dreamless. For a while, it was enough to simply exist. They helped the villagers with their work, walked along the beaches, and spent quiet evenings talking about anything but the ship that had haunted them. But even as the days stretched into weeks, a subtle unease lingered. It wasn't the same suffocating presence they'd felt before, but a faint echo, like the ghost of a memory that refused to fade. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily and Thomas sat by the fire in the small inn that had become their temporary home. The Codex mare lay closed on the table between them, its weathered cover bathed in the flickering light. "What happens now?" Thomas asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Emily sipped her tea, her gaze distant. "We move on, I guess. Try to live our lives. And if it comes back?" She hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of the cup. "Then we deal with it, like we always have." Thomas nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "You don't think it's really over, do you?" "No," she admitted, "but I think we've done enough for now. The Aurora's connection to this world is broken. If it ever comes back, it'll have to start over." Her words seemed to comfort him. But the doubt in his eyes didn't fade. That night, Emily woke with a start. The room was dark, the fire reduced to glowing embers in the hearth. For a moment, she wasn't sure what had woken her. But then she heard it, a faint tapping at the window. Her heart skipped a beat as she sat up, her gaze darting to the glass. The sound came again, soft but insistent. Thomas stirred beside her, his eyes blinking open. "What is it?" he mumbled. Emily didn't answer. She climbed out of bed, her movements slow and deliberate, and approached the window. The tapping stopped as she drew near, replaced by a faint, whispering voice. "Emily." She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The voice was familiar, but distorted, as though it were coming from underwater. "Emily, let me in." The words sent a chill down her spine, and she backed away from the window, her hands trembling. Thomas was at her side in an instant, his hand on her arm. "What is it?" he asked again, his voice sharper now. She shook her head, unable to speak. The next morning, Emily sat at the edge of the cliffs, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The sea was calm, the sky clear, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. Thomas joined her, his expression grim. "You heard it again, didn't you?" She nodded, her stomach twisting. "It's still out there." He sighed, sitting down beside her. "Then what do we do? We've destroyed the anchors, severed the connection. What else is there?" Emily didn't respond. She didn't have an answer, and the uncertainty gnawed at her. That evening, they returned to the library, determined to find something they might have missed. The Codex Mare offered little help, its fragmented passages only adding to their frustration. But as they searched the shelves, Emily's fingers brushed against a slim, leather-bound journal tucked between two larger books. She pulled it out, curious, and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was neat but hurried, and the words were dated over a century ago. "This ship is not of this world. It is a force, a presence that cannot be destroyed, but it can be contained." Emily's pulse quickened as she read on. The journal belonged to a sailor who had survived an encounter with the Aurora long before their time. His account was harrowing, filled with descriptions of shifting corridors, shadowy figures, and a suffocating sense of dread. But one passage stood out. "The Aurora feeds on those who are lost, who seek escape from their lives. Its power lies not in the anchors or the navigator, but in its purpose. To defeat it, one must face what they seek to escape." Emily sat back, the words sinking in. "It's not about the ship," she murmured. "It's about us." Thomas frowned. "What do you mean?" "The Aurora isn't just a force, it's a reflection. It feeds on our fears, our desires, our need to escape. That's why it came to us in the first place. It's not about the anchors or the navigator. It's about what brought us to the ship." The realization hit them both like a wave. To truly end the Aurora's hold, they had to confront the reasons they'd been drawn to it. For Emily, it was the crushing monotony of her life, the endless cycle of work and exhaustion that had driven her to seek something more. For Thomas, it was the guilt and regret over choices he couldn't change, a desire to outrun his past. The next few days were spent in introspection, each of them grappling with the truths they tried to avoid. It was painful, but necessary. And then, on a quiet evening as the sun dipped below the horizon, they made their way to the cliffs one final time. They stood at the edge, the wind tugging at their clothes, and looked out at the sea. The waves were calm, the water catching the golden light of the setting sun. Emily closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. "We're here," she said softly. "If you want us, come and face us." For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the waves. Then, slowly, the air grew heavier. The wind picked up, carrying with it a faint, familiar hum. The Aurora emerged from the mist, its black sails silhouetted against the twilight sky. It was smaller than before, less imposing, but no less menacing. At its bow stood the navigator, its hollow eyes fixed on them. "You cannot escape," it said, its voice echoing across the cliffs. "We're not trying to," Emily replied, her voice steady. The navigator raised a hand, the ship lurching forward. But this time, Emily and Thomas didn't run. They stood their ground, Facing the ship and the shadowy figure at its helm, the hum grew louder, the wind howling around them, but they didn't falter. And then, as the Aurora drew closer, something shifted. The ship began to flicker, its form dissolving like mist under the morning sun. The navigator let out a guttural roar, its figure collapsing into shadows. The Aurora's presence faded, the oppressive weight lifting as the ship disappeared into the void. Emily and Thomas stood in silence, the wind dying down to a gentle breeze. "It's over," Thomas said finally, his voice filled with quiet relief. Emily nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. For the first time, the sea felt truly calm. In the weeks that followed, Emily and Thomas left Gravesend, ready to start new lives. The memories of the Aurora lingered, but they were no longer burdens. They had faced the ship, and in doing so, had reclaimed their freedom. The Aurora was gone, its hold broken, but deep in her heart, Emily knew the truth. The ship wasn't just a force of darkness. It was a reflection of the human soul, a reminder of the shadows we carry and the light we must seek. And if it ever returned, they would be ready,